My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, want to get right back into it in our study of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and the resurrection. I want to look at the false presuppositions that are held by the huge majority of commentators when they come to 1 Corinthians 15. The basic presupposition, you find it in 110% virtually of the commentaries, is there were some scoffers at Corinth who were denying the physical resurrection. Period. There will never be, they said, a physical resurrection. Therefore, Paul set out to prove them wrong and to prove that there will be a physical resurrection. Well, there are many problems with that. We're going to cover those, or some of them at least, as we proceed in our study. But here's something you need to know. Not once does Paul ever use the term physical resurrection. Never. Now, does he absolutely have to? Well, I suppose a person could argue that it is not absolutely necessary, but I mean, after all, in all of Paul's writings about resurrection, if he wanted to just explicitly say there will be a physical resurrection, why didn't he say that? But he doesn't. Secondly, there is abundant evidence right here in 1 Corinthians 15 to prove that Paul was not talking about a yet future physical resurrection of physical bodies coming out of the grave, like we are told by the great majority of evangelical Christianity. This is proven by an examination of Paul's modus ponens form of argumentation. Now, modus ponens is kind of a technical term used in the logical world. And to put it another way, it is, if this is true, then this over here is true. And to go into that just a little bit deeper, what Paul did was to say, okay, you scoffers, if you say this, then of necessity, this is true. Now, when Paul would point out that their belief, their denial would lead to an affirmation of this position, Paul understood they did not believe this position over here. So they would recoil in horror, saying, Paul, no, we believe this over here. And Paul would respond, well, okay, guys, if you believe this over here, then you must believe in the resurrection of the dead ones. Now, look, it's not simply the dead, it is the dead ones, nekroi in the Greek, as many scholars have pointed out. Now, watch this. I covered this ever so briefly, but I want to drive this point home by a little closer examination of a couple of the if-then arguments that Paul uses initially. If, verse 15, or verse 12, if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say there is no resurrection of the dead ones? Now watch this. If there is no resurrection of the dead ones, then Christ is not risen. And the desired result of that argument would be for them to say, Paul, just stop right there. We believe Christ has been raised from the dead. We do not deny that Christ has been raised from the dead. Paul will use that very admission and that very affirmation to draw his point home when he will say, Christ has become the first fruit out from among the dead ones, those who had already died before Christ. Well, ask yourself the question who that was. because it's that group of people out from among whom Christ had been raised, but of whom he was the first to be raised from the dead, out from among the dead. So here is Paul affirming, okay, guys, you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And they're going, that's right, Paul, we believe that. Well, if you deny the resurrection of the dead ones, of whom Christ is the first fruit, of whom Christ was the first to be raised out from among them, you can't believe both positions. You can't deny resurrection life to them and affirm that Christ was raised from the dead, because Christ was the first to be raised out from among them. And thus, Paul's very first salvo in his argument is focused like a laser on the foundational doctrine of Jesus Christ's resurrection. If Christ was not raised from the dead, there is no resurrection, not only for the dead ones, but as he will go ahead and say, there is no resurrection life for the Christians who had died either. We'll get to that argument and its importance and significance. But for now, you must realize, you just have to catch the power of the fact that Paul is taking what the scoffers believe. They believe in the resurrection of Jesus. But the resurrection of Jesus in Paul's theology is absolutely positive proof that the dead ones, i.e., those who had died before Christ, would also be raised. That is incredibly powerful, because it shows us, as we'll develop more, that the scoffers at Corinth, number one, were not denying Christ's resurrection. Number two, they were not denying the resurrection of Christians. And on it goes. There was only a very select, specific group of people that the scoffers in Corinth were denying would receive resurrection life. And that group of people were those that had died before Jesus. But Jesus' resurrection as the first fruit out from among them proved that the dead ones, those who had died before Jesus, would in fact receive resurrection life. Okay, well, we got a whole lot more to look at the argumentation that Paul employs to prove that the scoffers in Corinth were not denying resurrection. They were only denying resurrection to a specific group of people. We will have more on 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul's argument against the scoffers on the flip side. We'll see you there.